As we come into the fall, states are releasing guidelines and benchmarks for how and when to open schools for face to face instruction. And schools around the nation are implementing those guidelines. So it's worth asking what those benchmarks are really all about. Now, I'm going to talk about Arizona. It happens to be where I live. You could go through these for any state and come to the same basic conclusions. In Arizona, number of cases, if fewer than 100 people per 100,000 per week get COVID for 2 straight weeks, or if numbers just come down regardless of how high they are for 2 weeks, you're good to go. Fewer than 7% of people tested should be positive, and fewer than 10% of the people who go to emergency rooms should be there for COVID. Meet those restrictions, and Arizona tells you that you can safely return to in-person instruction. Problem is that I don't know what those mean. I mean, I'm a numbers guy. I'm an astrophysicist. I've been reading the epidemiological literature now for 6 months. I've been crawling around inside these numbers, and I don't know what they mean in terms of things that I actually care about. I mean, there are things that you can say. For example, if you look at Arizona's guidelines, they're right at the break between what is called moderate community transmission and substantial community transmission. So schools are obviously going to make things worse at some level. So count on, yeah, if you open schools, you're going to have substantial community transmission. That's where we are. That sounds a little dicey already to me, to be frank. But again, what does that really mean in terms that just, people can understand, the public, board members, teachers, parents? How do you take that and turn it into numbers that make real sense to them? And it all kind of comes down to what you mean by safely. When I think about safely, I don't think about some, strange metric for emergency room visits. When I think about safely, I want to know things like how many people are going to die. How many people are going to have their health ruined? How many students, staff, teachers are going to wind up getting sick or dying? What's the impact going to be on families that kids carry this home to, on the community as a whole? That's what I would like to know about. Now, those are difficult questions to answer because epidemiology is hard. And you can bet that the people who wrote those guidelines can't give you answers to those questions any better than I can. And in fact, if you look at it, for the most part, those guidelines are more politics than they are science. All you have to do is compare guidelines from a very conservative state with guidelines from a very liberal state to realize that guidelines are largely statements about political ideology rather than statements about how COVID behaves. With that said, though, there are some things that we can be confident about. For example, you may have heard it said that children don't transmit COVID. We know that that is not true. For example, there was a recent study out of South Korea, 65,000 people, that found that kids older than 10 are as likely to get and spread the disease as adults, and that kids younger than 10 are maybe less likely to get it, but because of their social behaviors, they probably spread it as effectively as anybody else. Another thing about which we can be confident is that COVID is spread by asymptomatic carriers, people who don't have any symptoms. Children fall into this category especially. And that makes it extremely difficult to control because somebody can be there and look perfectly healthy and be a COVID super spreader. We know that COVID-19 is airborne, and that is a really big deal because it means that it's not about just spitting in somebody's face or smearing something on a desk. What it means is that COVID gets into aerosol particles that drift around in the air, and that if you're in a confined space, staying 6 feet apart isn't going to protect you. You can still very much get the disease, and especially if the ventilation isn't very good. And frankly, most public schools tend to have inadequate ventilation. Um, you put all of that together, and it turns out that classrooms are ideal environments in which COVID-19 can spread. Article from the Wall Street Journal, the major culprit when we're talking now about spread of COVID is close-up person-to-person interactions for extended periods. Crowded events, poorly ventilated areas, and places where people are talking loudly or singing in one famous case maximize the risk. Now, if that's not a description of a classroom, I don't know what would be. Another thing we can be confident of is that COVID very definitely spreads in school environments, although you might not hear about it. Mississippi, for example, does not require schools to disclose COVID outbreaks. Wrap your head around that one. As an example, this wasn't a school, it was a camp, but still, you got a bunch of kids and teacher-like people together for 3 days. And after that 3 days, despite the fact that everybody who went to that camp had been tested for COVID and was negative, that 3 days in, there was an outbreak that roughly half, it's thought, of the entire camp, in fact, 3/4 of those who were actually tested, were positive for COVID. So that's what can happen if you get kids and adults together in those kinds of environments. And again, another thing that we know is that young people carry COVID-19 home to their families and communities. Many, many examples. I'll pick on the one in upstate New York, DeWitt, where it was a daycare in-home care situation, and there was one asymptomatic kid, and the outcome of that was 16 people had COVID, and I believe those were spread over 4 different families. So when you talk about COVID in schools, you're not talking about COVID in schools, you're talking about COVID in the community. Another thing that we know is that students, and for that matter teachers, can't be counted on to comply with procedures. We're talking about having large numbers of people together in fairly close quarters for hours a day, 5 days a week, for months. If you think that in that kind of an environment, you are going to have careful adherence to wear your mask, don't get closer than 6 feet to anybody, always look in other don't go face to face with anybody, don't share your pencil, don't. If you think that's actually going to happen, then I've got some wonderful swampland that I would love to sell you. Here, for example, was a photo that went viral. This was a high school in Georgia where this is a picture of the hall during passing period. And I think there might be one kid in that is actually wearing a mask. Another thing that we know is there have been schools at this point that have been open for about a week. Georgia, for example, opened about a week and a half ago. And if you look at Georgia, they are already seeing schools across the state that are having problems. And in fact, in one case, just after a week, before school even started, teachers had been back on campuses just to get ready for the upcoming school year. And they wound up with large numbers of teachers infected. So we are already seeing the spread after only a week in a very few places. Another thing that we know is that teachers are a vulnerable population. I won't go into that in detail other than to say that some of us aren't spring chickens. And finally, we can say that COVID-19 is extremely difficult to contain. For example, Europe, which did a wildly, spectacularly better job of it than the United States did. They got their numbers down to something like, I don't know, maybe a 30th, 20th or 30th of where the United States is, and kept them there. And then they very, very carefully started trying to open some things up. And you can see for yourself from the plot what happened. So these are things that we do know. We know that kids spread COVID. We know about asymptomatic carriers. We know it's airborne. We know that classrooms are a great place for it to spread. We know that young people carry it home to their families. We know that perfect compliance is a fantasy. We know that even in the United States, that in places that have been open for a week, we are already seeing the spread, even though it takes a while before you start to see cases. We know that teachers are vulnerable, and we know that COVID is it's contagious, man. It is difficult to contain. Now, that's what we know. So I can't turn that into an exact number of, okay, here are how many people are going to die, and here are how many people are going to get sick. But what I can say is that if that's not a recipe for disaster, I don't know what would be. Here's what's going to happen to schools that try to reopen this fall. There are schools who will try it, and the vast majority of those, it's just not going to work. It's going to blow up in their face. And people know it. Anthony Fauci gave a virtual town hall in late July to the American Federation of Teachers. Now, Fauci has to be very careful about what he says. And he's come out and said that. He said, look, if I'm too upfront about stuff, I get fired, and I'm not, then I can't help anybody. But even so, I would like you to read between the lines here. In many respects, unfortunately, you, that is teachers, are going to actually be part of the experiment of the learning curve of what we need to know. Early on, the schools were shut down, so we don't know the full impact. And we don't have the total database of knowing what there is to expect. Again, you read between the lines there, and he just said that teachers and students and parents of students and people who know parents of students are lab rats to see just how hard we can push COVID before the whole thing blows up on us. But it turns out that's an experiment that has already been run. It was run in Israel. Let's look at Israel here for a second. Actually, first, I want to put the United States up there as just for comparison purposes. Israel, out of the gate, they did it right. Soon as COVID hit, they locked things down. They locked things down tightly, even much more so than most of Europe. In a short period of time, they had things down to very, very few cases. They were down to something like 1.4 cases per million people per day, as compared with the United States right now being something like, 200 cases per million per day. And that's when they decided that, okay, we've got this thing under control, so it's probably okay to open schools and open some restaurants and things like that. And for about a week, things seemed to be okay. And then they seemed like maybe they weren't going to be so okay after all. Only 2 weeks later, after schools were reopened, the number of cases had gone up by a factor of 10. They were now up at 13 cases per million per day. They had had 130 cases of COVID at a single school. 42 schools had closed. 6,800 students and teachers were quarantined. That's after 2 weeks, when they were just starting to see the impacts. And by 2 months later, they were up at 208 cases per million per day. So about a factor of 150 worse than they had been. Almost 400 schools closed. And if you look at June was an interesting month, because in June, when this was just happening, they were studying this, they were tracking cases, they were doing all of that. And what they found is that half of all infections, that is all infections, not just the ones they could trace, just half of all infections could be traced directly back to schools. In other words, when you look at what happened in Israel, schools were the reason. Epidemiological surveys by Israel's health ministry showed that after Israel opened its entire school system without restrictions on May 17th, a spike in infections occurred among the country's youth that later spread to the general population. So again, we have done the experiment. Israel is about 9 million people. Arizona is somewhere on the high side of 7 million, so yeah, kind of comparable. If you were to take what happened in Israel and apply it to Arizona using our current case fatality rate, then you'd say that you would expect maybe 1,300 people to die in Arizona as a result of having schools open after just a couple of months. How do we choose which 1,300 people get to die so that we can have face-to-face classes instead of online classes? I can't tell you that's the exact number. I mean, your mileage will vary. What I can say, though, is that things are far, far worse off in the United States right now than they were in Israel when they opened up. Yeah, anyway. So here's the Israel experience. People just like here right now wanted their kids back in school. They were put our kids back in school, and they did. And man, it was great, and people were excited, and their kids were back in school, and there was celebration. And then kids got sick, and kids gave it to teachers, and kids and teachers carried it out into the community. And within a matter of about 2 months, the situation was that Israel had gone from almost no cases to one of the worst outbreaks in the world. And the trigger was opening schools. So, there's a glimpse at our own future. Again, I can't tell you exactly what the numbers will be, but I can tell you that the experiment has been run and that what happens here is going to be ugly. There's no two ways about it. Unfortunately, it seems like it's an experiment we're going to run anyway. Again, the AZ safely returning to in-person instruction is what the document says. Benchmarks like this are worthless. Benchmarks like this are not tied back to anything that you and I would understand as risk having to do with death or health or anything else. But these benchmarks are worse than worthless because this promises that you're going to safely return to school. So you're telling people, yeah, come do this. It's safe. And no, it's not. We're doing this thing. Let the needless dying begin.